I'm Ann Artis. I am Director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center and Interim Deputy Provost this year. So on behalf of the Center as well as the University, I want to welcome you to this event, the first of a Perspectives on Digital Humanities series. Before I thank the financial sponsors of today's first talk, can I please ask people who are involved, silence your cell phones. And before I'll forget this housekeeping too. Paul Hyde is sending around a piece of paper. If you would like to continue to be apprised of things in this series, give us your email address, okay? So, before I thank the financial sponsors, can I get the folks who've been part of the Digital Humanities Working Group to either stand or wave at everybody? It's been a wonderful group to work with, and it involves people. I'm going to identify you. I'm not going to just. Maureen Check, University Library. Erica Armstrong Dunbar isn't here today because of the weather. Gabrielle Foreman is stuck in Connecticut. Erica's in history. Gabrielle's in English. Paul Hyde, IT, Academic Technologies, is somewhere in the room. Tracy Jentz, History Media Center, designed this flyer, which there are 50 copies of at the back of the room. Some of you got this earlier today electronically, but if you're interested in a paper product, pick it up as you walk out. Heidi Kaufman in English is here, I think. Matt Kinservik is faculty member in English and Associate Dean for the Humanities, College of Arts and Sciences. Hannah Lee, you didn't see Hannah come. University Library. Meg Myman, Undergraduate Research and the Department of English. Rebecca Johnson-Melvin, University Library. Tim Murray, University Library. Eric Rao, probably got stuck, Director of the Library at Hagley. May still be trying to get here. Robin Schultze, I didn't see. Mark Samuels Lasner is not here as well. And then last but not least, Greg Silvis, who has been very helpful in getting stuff up and running. Planning for this series began early last spring, and I want to thank everyone publicly for their efforts to date and all of the great conversations along the way. Our working group has talked about the transformations in scholarly communication practices that are underway in 21st century research and teaching environments. We've talked about issues of open access and the engagement of broader public audiences that can be facilitated through digital platforms and social media. And we've put issues in graduate humanities education and the emergence of what's called in DH fields alternative academic careers, Alt-Ac, on our collective radar screens as we've considered how the kinds of collaborations between IT and library staff and academic disciplines that our own DH working group in a very, very modest way are leveraging, the ways that these kind of collaborations are leveraging both new employment opportunities for PhD candidates in the humanities and, even more importantly, innovative partnerships between high-level university-based researchers and museums, foundations, and industry. This lecture series is the result of our shared interest in creating a series of teachable moments for the campus community as a whole regarding national and international conversations about these sorts of issues. And the accompanying library workshop series, which begins Friday, 3:30 to 5, this room, is designed to give faculty and students opportunities to learn more about current University of Delaware library resources supporting digital humanities and teaching. I want to take this opportunity, too, to thank the financial sponsors of this series as well. George Watson, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, has been very generous in his support of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center since its establishment in 2009. And Susan Brinteson, the Mae Morris Vice Provost of University Libraries, has been generous enough to let us stage all of these events in the Class of 1941 lecture room, as well as helped offer funding to support this series. And I shout out as well to John Ernest. Where did he go? He was here, back in the corner. John, thank you for honoring the commitment that the Department of English made last spring, when Ian Crawford was acting chair. Finally, a few words about today's speaker, Professor Jeffrey Schnapp. Some of you know Professor Schnapp as a distinguished scholar, primarily anchored in the field of Italian studies, whose research interests extend extraordinarily from antiquity to the present and encompass the material history of literature, the history of 20th century architecture and design, and the cultural history of science and engineering. Professor Schnapp has published extensively on topics ranging from late antique patchwork poetry to futurist and Dadaist visual poetics, the cultural history of coffee consumption, glass architecture, and the iconography of the pipe in modern art. He has served as co-editor of Modernism and Modernity, the official journal of the Modernist Studies Association, almost since its establishment by Johns Hopkins University Press 20 years ago. He's collaborated with several international museums on major exhibitions, perhaps most importantly the Trento Tunnels project that was featured in the Italian pavilion of the 2010 Venice Biennale for Architecture. And he founded and directed Stanford University's Humanities Lab for 10 years before joining the faculty at Harvard very recently. It's in his current capacity as the director of Harvard's Berman Center for Internet and Society, and as the mastermind behind its newest facility, metaLAB, that we've invited Professor Schnapp here today to talk about both the trajectory of his scholarly career and his vision for metaLAB. If you happen to have visited metaLAB's website, you will know that this lab, this collaboratory, was founded on the belief that many of the key research challenges and opportunities of our era, fundamental questions regarding experience in a connected world, democracy and social justice, the boundaries between nature and culture, all of these transcend divisions between the arts, humanities, and sciences. They transcend divisions between the academy, industry, and the public sphere, and between theoretical and applied knowledge. And you will know, too, that the metaLAB functions simultaneously as both a community of scholars, artists, designers, journalists, technologists, architects, and students. Importantly, I think, students, engaged in team-based experiments that merge research, teaching, publication, social action, and the use and development of digital tools. It functions in that way, but it also functions as an e-publishing lab dedicated to modeling the print plus and post-print publishing genres of the new millennium. Throughout his career, Professor Schnapp has been a visionary institution builder as well as an amazingly accomplished scholar. His talk today is entitled Teaching Design Thinking. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome on this yucky, wintry, cold November day.
Issuing feedback here. Thank you so much for coming out on this wintry day, and it's really a pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do, I have the privilege of leading this series of conversations on the topic of the digital humanities, is to sort of frame my own vision, my own understanding of the digital humanities within a larger set of debates that are going on within this broad umbrella of practices referred to, for better or for worse, as the digital humanities. And all such labels typically are labels that happen sort of after the fact, in a sense. The Cubists did not realize that they were Cubists until an ill-disposed critic referred to the ugly paintings that they were attaching to the walls of galleries as cubism, and then the label stuck, much as Obamacare has become even Obama's own way of describing his healthcare reform. So what I broadly would describe as this series of conjunctions of new sets of opportunities as spaces of experimentation that characterized the world of my own work, as well as the work of metaLAB at Harvard. I'm rather than placing it under the aegis of digital humanities, which is a label I'm going to talk about in a second, I'd like to particularly talk about the way in which design serves as a kind of glue holding together the two gerunds in my title, teaching on the one side and thinking on the other. And for the word thinking, one could insert also the word research, in a sense. I'm going to talk about a universe where there's very little separation between teaching and thinking, and where design plays a crucial role in building a bridge between those two worlds. One of the differences between being a scholar like the kind of scholar I was trained to be as a specialist in 13th, 14th century medieval Mediterranean Europe, and the world of possibilities for scholarship today is that all of the sort of models of what knowledge look like, of what scholarship look like, certain sets of norms and assumptions about the scholarly monograph, the essay, the sort of standard tokens, the kind of currency of scholarship, and the models of communication and argument that those models had embedded in their own history, that when we move from that sort of world, that's the familiar world, into a world that is, in my view, mostly not a post-print world, but rather a print plus world. In other words, where print will coexist with other forms, sometimes forms of knowledge that are natively non-print, is that every research project becomes a design project, a question where we don't know exactly what the genre is in which we're answering a set of research questions. We have to think about the design of the very knowledge we produce. So in the context of this talk, which is going to be a talk that will go from a series of broad questions about what is digital humanities? So how do I understand at least digital humanities? What are the big battles, if you like, the battlefronts, and what position does somebody like myself take within that battlefield? I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's a useful entry point to some of the issues that I'd like to detail further. I want to move from that to looking at some areas of opportunity, areas of experimentation that I see as some of the interesting and rich horizons for future work. And I want to then turn to talking about examples of practice, because one of the few pearls of wisdom, one of the few lessons I've learned in being involved in this sort of experimental forms of scholarship over the years is that one can engage in infinite amounts of theoretical and abstract conversation about transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, innovation, but where the rubber hits the road is when you engage in modeling those futures rather than in conversation about those futures. And you really see what the institutional stakes are. You see where the opportunities are. You see where the limits are. So I'm very interested in, I think Anne alluded to this in her very generous introduction, in enriching the universe of humanities research through a model of humanities training and research that grants increasingly grants importance to forms of practice, to problem solving, to making as a feature of humanistic knowledge, rather than as a world that's somehow opposed to this theoretical realm of inquiry. So I think looking at examples of practice is where the rubber hits the road. And so I want to talk about some examples of ongoing projects that are taking place within my own work world, but also in metaLAB. Is it possible to drop the lights a little bit in the front here? Because it seems it's a little glary on the slide there. It'd be great if we could. Let's see if we get lucky, especially this like front row of lights here. Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize they were right there. Oh, that's better. Maybe this one too. That row. Okay. Yeah. That's. Or actually, can you? As long as we're at it. There we. Oh, it's either. Maybe we should just go dark, go cinematic. Yeah, there we go. That's better. There we go. Thank you. Thank you so much. So one of the big questions is for my first experiences in this field go back to, I was not an extremely geeky high school student, but curious, interested in art practice on the one side and a little bit in sort of what then counted as computation. And my first experiences of what would come to be called the digital humanities, only within the last decade or so, was when I was hired as an assistant professor at Dartmouth College, which was the first wired campus in the United States, because its president, John Kemeny, was the inventor of the BASIC programming language. And Kemeny had this vision of the future of the college and of the university that imagined this bold notion that there would be workstations where students could use this new communications technology called email to communicate rather than more conventional forms of messaging. And for that very reason, the National Endowment for the Humanities, its first digital initiative was the Dartmouth Dante Project. I'm a Dante scholar by training, which was to take the corpus of line-by-line annotations of the Divine Comedy, which begin with Dante's own sons. In other words, it's a continuous tradition of indexing and commentary, much like the Talmud or the Bible, starting in 1321 with Dante's own sons and extending to the present, all line indexed, perfect for computers, because computers are not very smart when it comes to identifying links between different kinds of textual artifacts. But this is all fully structured for a computer in a sense. 6 centuries of incredibly rich commentary, a history of reading practices in the West, many major figures involved. I was involved in that project starting in 1983, and that was really, back then, what now is called digital humanities was called computational humanities. And most of what was done by computational humanists actually begins, believe it or not, as early as 1948, 1947, when Father Robert Bouza, the Jesuit scholar, first started working with IBM mainframe computers. And like a good scholar of the scholastic tradition, the immediate thing that he thought when he saw the computing power of mainframe computers was, gee, we could produce even better concordances to the works of Thomas Aquinas. Why not, right? And that's what early computational kind of humanities looked like. I mention that because that was a world that was involved in producing supports, in producing reference tools. It was not where the action was for humanities scholars. And I think one of the differences between that kind of model of digital or computationally rich or informed humanities work and the work that now comes under the rubric of digital humanities is a shift, increasing importance, that comes right to the core of where the action is, where the major scholarly and research questions are, many of which are qualitative and interpretive questions. And that was not true for a lot of that early history. So when we speak of digital humanities, what do we mean? Well, these are some basic questions that I think define the state of the conversation right now. And it's an early conversation. I mean, we're barely really a decade and a half into this conversation, I would say. Is digital humanities about the digital? That's a question that's regularly asked. Is it about the humanities? To what degree does the word humanities really refer to a classically described set of fields? Is it the right label? There's a lot of conversation around that question. There seem to be 2 main threads, one focused on the analysis of texts, the other on forms of multimedia-based practice, even with regard to textual corpora. And that includes also a larger debate about the qualitative and the quantitative, the balance, the possibility that the humanities might re-engage with the social sciences, particularly the quantitative social sciences. Where does digital humanities belong? Does it belong in English departments, media studies departments? Does it belong in departments? Is digital humanities dedicated somehow to a post-print world, a world of the purely digital, in a sense, as a vehicle for scholarly communication, or to some other model? And in answer to those questions that are on that list, I'm going to answer a kind of no. Certainly, I don't think that, as I just implied, that the digital humanities is in any sense about the digital. Many of the leading scholars, many of the leading innovators are people who work in fields that work with pre-modern corpora. Classicists have played a defining role in the field of digital humanities. And that's for a reason. They work with cultural objects that have real difficulties of intelligibility, that create basic challenges to make them readable, in a sense. And they often belong to a world outside the culture of print, the culture that has defined all of our standard assumptions and norms about what constitutes knowledge. Is it about the humanities? A lot of the most interesting and exciting work isn't about the humanities in any classical sense. It blurs the boundary lines between questions that people ask in social science fields or natural science fields. So it's certainly about the humanities in the sense it brings certain kinds of skills, practices, and methodologies that I think are the historical strength of humanities disciplines into conversations that are often not about classic humanistic objects of inquiry. And I think that's an interesting space of experimentation itself. There are these different currents. There are currents that often don't share basic values. So under the umbrella of digital humanities, the reality is we have a kind of ecology of often very conflicting views about what's an interesting area of experimentation. I think the issue of a kind of reconciliation between areas of the quantitative social science and the humanities versus a more qualitative approach that's closer to areas of art practice. That's a constant strain within the conversation. And you'll probably hear many different views within the course of your the lecture series here. I think in the case, the questions that have to do with location are really crucial questions, and I'm really happy that this series is happening in a library, because I do, in some deep sense, I don't think that digital humanities belongs in departments. I think that the library is the laboratory for the humanities disciplines, and therefore it's the natural place where information technologies, the corpora that are the kind of database, if you like, for humanities, and research questions in many disciplines, not just the humanities, where they come together and where different traditions of expertise, description, analysis kind of naturally meet. I think they're naturally, in a sense, find a natural home. Another model is, of course, to think about the laboratory as a space, and that's been, for me, the most important model in terms of rethinking what it means to be a humanistic scholar, what it means to be a historian of culture, which is how I define myself. So for me, in the position that I occupy, at least, a position that attributes to design a kind of central starring role, if you like, in the areas of scholarly endeavor that I'm involved. What digital humanities means to me is very much associated with this word, the laboratory, as a place of experimentation and investigation. And the laboratory, I will share an anecdote. When I started the Stanford Humanities Lab, I was in a kind of conversation with the president of Stanford at the time, Gerhard Casper, who's a very distinguished constitutional jurist. And we had been talking about what the next kind of most visionary enterprise in the humanities could be that Stanford could undertake. And we were struggling for a title, to find a name for this place. And I said, I've got it. You know, it's the Stanford Humanities Laboratory. And he said in a good German kind of jurist's voice, isn't that an oxymoron? And I said, yes, you got it. So what does the laboratory mean in that phrase? What it means, models of knowledge production that involve co-creation. And that co-creation and teamwork and collaboration, it can include the classroom as a place where knowledge is not just studied, but produced. The idea of a project-based model of learning where the classroom is a place where students get involved in actually, much like in a natural science lab, contributing a piece under the guidance of an expert practitioner in a field of knowledge to a larger mosaic, to a larger endeavor. The second is a more iterative model of practice. Print-based models of scholarship are tremendously powerful and have really shaped all of our sort of core concepts that are still the defining concepts of what scholarship looks like. But print is a medium that creates this magic moment, which is the moment of publication, when knowledge gels into this form and it goes out into the world. And there are book launch parties, and eventually a book reaches its critics, and eventually they respond in some way. They appraise, they evaluate. That community of readers reads the book, and it enters or doesn't enter into streams of conversation. We are now in a world that's much more about iterative models of publication, and that scares a lot of people, but it's also a very rich world of possibility when you think about collaborative authorship, about the possibility that a book can be continued to be produced or added to or extended or augmented or animated by whole communities of researchers. And that's a world which requires a space more like a laboratory than it does like a traditional scriptorium, which is like a monastic cell where we work in isolation, much like humanists have for many centuries. Some of these other affordances, these sets of possibilities that I think are exciting, that animate a lot of the debates and discussions and conflicts within the digital humanities, involve expanding our basic understanding of what counts as scholarship, what counts as a form of argument, what contributes to knowledge. And those certainly would include the increasing role that visualization and visualization techniques and tools are playing in forms of argument and scholarly practice. And I will show you some examples of metaLAB work in this area. They include using big data approaches, using essentially marshaling the tremendous power of big data to tell us stories about phenomena that would escape they're necessarily beyond the capabilities of individual scholars, just because of their sheer quantity. But they also include using visualization tools for very, really micro, fine-grained questions. The dominant traditions of argument within the humanities, as well as in many of the social sciences, are not traditions where visualization has played a defining role. That has clearly changed, and it is changing as we speak. I think one of the most exciting areas with the fields that interest me, I think the most, have to do particularly with forms of cultural practice that inherently are fragile or have escaped becoming part of the cultural record. I'm a medievalist by training, as I mentioned, and we know that the vast majority of medieval culture is lost in the silence of the vaults, not because we haven't discovered it. It's that it simply took the form of non-transcribed forms of culture. Much of early vernacular culture was thought to be ontologically deeply enmeshed in the idea of orality or performance, the event, the live. And live forms, until the rise of certain forms of media, like sound recording and video capture, were simply outside of the framework of kinds of forms of analysis and argument. We have a tremendously rich tradition of critical editions and annotation of print artifacts, or written artifacts, but we don't have that for sound artifacts or for, let's say, live performance-based forms of culture, like performance and theater. And these areas are really rich with possibility. They create openings for new kinds of cultural history. They're much richer than the kinds of history that could be practiced in those domains until now. Last but not least, and this relates to my own interest, and I'll say something about this more in a second, in curatorial practice in the museological sense, in the space of museums, different kinds of museums. I think one of the shifts that's happening is also a broadened notion of what counts as scholarship itself that includes breaking down some old partitions and walls that used to separate, for instance, what happens in an art gallery or in an exhibition space versus what happens on the page that counts as real scholarship. It used to be in the field of art history that it was thought to be, there were two tracks. You could become a curator, and that's like being a scholar, but it's not like a scholar with a capital S. It's sort of like a slightly diminished scholar. And then there's the real scholars, the real historians. That partitioning is breaking down as we speak, and I think it's happening in the literary fields as well. And part of that breakdown involves increasingly acknowledging that arguments that are made in space, through objects, through exhibition installation, that practices of curation, of curating corpora in different fields, that those are a form of scholarship, and they're integral to innovation on the scholarly side, that these aren't two separate worlds. They're worlds that overlap increasingly. And the moral of that story, which is something I'm going to come back to, is that the digital is not about the digital. It's about the physical. It's about reorganizing our experience. We are spatial creatures. We are not going to turn into little pixels on the screen like some futurists imagined in terms of the rise of virtual worlds as a kind of alternate reality. We are deeply physical creatures. We navigate space. We gain information about the world by touching things, by rotating objects, by experiencing through the use of all of our senses. And in that context, forms of scholarly practice that begin to bleed into forms of argument in space or attempts to imaginatively interweave information in space. I mean, those are core design questions that are changing fields of all the design fields, architecture and so forth. And I think they are tasks that also engage us as scholars, as scholarly practitioners. And I will talk in particular about a project that we have going on with trying to reimagine the library as a space. I talked a little bit about design. I talked a little bit about curation. I should mention that one of the other exciting horizons that the word digital and the word humanities brought together as this kind of adequate or not so adequate umbrella term to describe these experimental forms of scholarship that are increasingly reshaping the fields of humanistic inquiry. One of the opportunities also involves thinking about something that was not necessarily a defining feature of the pre-digital universe, and that is audience. The humanities disciplines are often built around cultural corpora that interest a very large number of people. We know that from museum attendance statistics, from library statistics, and so forth. And yet, much of that audience is very unlikely, if ever, to pick up a specialized journal or a monograph. And yet, there's this paradox that there is a kind of audience, in a sense, a potential, a hypothetical audience, but often scholarship and the languages of scholarship have difficulty speaking across these divides between the intramural and the extramural. And I think one of the exciting features of many of the most bold digital humanities projects involve really rethinking those boundary lines, imagining ways to maintain the kind of scholarly rigor, the traditions of kind of scientific rigor on the one, and critical rigor on the one side, and imagining a kind of more multi-channeling based model of how you communicate research to different kinds of communities, to design that work so that it speaks to different kinds of audiences. I'm going to leave that there, and now I want to turn to examples of practice, because I really think that is not only sort of where the rubber hits the road figuratively, but also it's there where we begin to see different ways of shaping, in a sense, a series of research questions, agendas, practices, areas of inquiry around these very broad and perhaps too abstract ambitions and themes. And the domains I'm going to talk about are all active projects that are going on at metaLAB. If you're wondering what a metaLAB is, it is the choice of the label. We wanted the word laboratory for the reasons I've already explained, but I didn't want the word digital in there for a reason I've also explained, because I think the word digital creates the illusion that somehow the lab's research methodologies, its practices, are somehow describable in terms of the digital. However central digital tools and methodologies are, a lot of what we do involves physical design, installation design, thinking, in other words, very much about space, about the weaving together, the creation of smart spaces, you might say, how to design a learning environment. What does a media room look like? What does a reading room look like in the 21st century? These kinds of questions. The word humanities is also not there, you'll notice, because we think of ourselves as a space of experimentation, and we're not sure where the humanities begin and end. We know that those who make up our community are people who have deep roots in different disciplinary traditions, and that's part of the richness of the mix of people. Creative technologists on the one side, people involved in different forms of research, even the most old-fashioned and consecrated forms of archivally based research, areas of communication, curatorial practice, and areas of design. The four broad areas that I'm going to just talk about and show some examples of practice in, and I'd be happy to come back. I'm going to sketch these out really quickly, come back in conversation to say more about them, are these four domains. The first involves thinking about this weaving together of information and space. I don't know if any of you have ever seen, like in a library, for instance, we're here in a library, a really good example of a room filled with workstations, or a really good microfiche or microfilm room. They're all terrible, and there's a reason why they're terrible. They were all afterthoughts. Our buildings were not designed to create a kind of ideal merging of LCD monitor and physical space. They were inserted there. Typically, sometimes there's planning and design and intention, but they're in no way do they give us a vision of like an ideal, a non-trivial way of creating such a space. This is true for all kinds of categories of spaces that want to be smart spaces, but we don't really have models for them. So one of the areas we got interested in early on in the history of metaLAB, really right from the start, was this question of what is the future of knowledge and learning spaces? What does a library in the 21st century, or a reading room in the 21st century look like? Like, what could a reading room be under the circumstances that are increasingly reshaping bricks and mortar library type institutions? And how do we create a culture of innovation and experimentation in an institution that, in a kind of noble and really fundamental way, has been so central and properly so dedicated to preserving, to conservation, to amassing and conserving for future generations? The second area I'm going to look at is big data. What cool things you can do with lots of data, with good data sets. How can we expand the compass of scholarship, tell stories, that are more interesting than the stories we could construct as scholars working in traditional methodologies with data sets. And here, too, I'm going to talk about libraries again. Libraries have highly curated sets of data. They're called card catalogs, which is, of course, a skeuomorphic notion, because the card catalog is usually in storage somewhere or long ago sent to the pulp mill. But those records were produced by people who are professionals in using standard descriptive techniques and languages. It's a social scientist's dream to have data sets that are as well curated as library catalogs are. So what if we can aggregate and make open library catalogs from across the world and use those as a research tool? There's some fantastic possibilities there that I'd like to talk about briefly. Then the other two models I'm going to talk about are bringing knowledge from the stacks out into the streets. What if curatorial practice, which we once associated with museums and exhibition spaces, all those skills at making arguments in space through assembling, ordering, creating sequences of objects, displaying them in certain forms, accompanying them with textual narratives, if those same skills are brought to bear on natural and urban landscapes. In other words, where the kind of knowledge that historians and of various kinds and sorts amass, create, interpret, is that kind of knowledge can also live in the very physical environments that that knowledge refers to. And the final one is the question of collections, of how these collections that are, in a sense, the laboratory within which humanistic knowledge unfolds. We study objects, we study textual repositories, we analyze texts. What if the divisions that have characterized the modern world of collections processing, a world where, for instance, I'll give you an example, when at Harvard or at an institution like the University of Delaware, an archive arrives, let's say of a researcher, like a scientist from the end of the 19th century. There's microscopes, there's lab notebooks, there's paper notes, there's the publications that came from using the instruments that were part of the lab. What's the first thing that has to happen? All those media types get segregated. The notes go to the archive. The instruments probably go to a history of scientific instruments collection. The publications probably go maybe into a specialized library. Maybe they go onto the stacks. And there are very good reasons for that process. But many of the research questions that we ask as researchers have to do with the relations between those things. So what would a world look like where things, three-dimensional objects, could live in a browser environment and be part of a relational field that includes these other kinds of documents, which are much more naturally have been part of the kind of information ecology of the web. This is an important question because the vast majority of cultural assets that exist today, that the whole history of the human record has handed down to us, is locked up in the storage closets of institutions of memory. At the Smithsonian, 96% of the collection is in storage. And a friend of mine who's a curator at the Smithsonian tells me that of that 96% of the collection that's not visible, almost half of that will never be seen by any member of the staff in the course of their entire career. That's how deep the storage is. And of course, it's important that such objects be stored. But the question is, what would happen if we had a world where those kinds of assets, those kinds of collections, could actually become objects that were shared, that were available to others, that could become sources of research? There's a lot of knowledge and information and rich sets of possibilities locked up in those storage bins. So how can we unlock those and leverage them? So let's start with the area of libraries. And I want to talk just briefly about the Library Test Kitchen, which is a lab that we started at the beginning, in the middle of last academic year, which began as a course taught at the Graduate School of Design by my colleague John Palfrey from the law school and myself. John Palfrey was the founder of the Digital Public Library of America. He's also a Berkman co-director. And we thought, at the time, the Harvard libraries, Harvard has somewhere between 73 and 92 libraries, each of which, by the way, was run rather autonomously until only about a decade and a half ago. So, of course, given the financial pressures of the last decade, given a whole series of factors, there's been this big conversation going on about how do we create a single library system out of this archipelago of very chaotic libraries, many of which have their own kind of classification systems that are based on the history of a specific discipline. And so, given this kind of urgent institutional conversation, we thought it would be interesting, and given, on the other hand, a conversation about the digital public library of America, this kind of mega Library of Congress type structure that would bring together all of the major research libraries in the country, maybe the entire public library system, it seemed like a really rich opportunity to bring designers, not just librarians, into the conversation, and to try to think about what it would be like to really try to build the library of the future, kind of one appliance at a time, one feature at a time. And so the idea was to initiate an experimental process, but an experimental process that was very strongly conditioned by the history, the kind of history of practices, the disciplines associated with the modern library as an institution. The idea was to bring together, to create a kind of studio seminar. In other words, a seminar with a studio, where we had Greg Naj come in and talk about the design of the Library of Pergamon and Alexandria. We had people with deep expertise in specific fields, moments of time where the library underwent a shift around a specific media revolution. In the case of medieval monastic libraries, the rise of certain forms of organizing and producing codices. In the case of the shift to print, the way in which libraries became these containers for an ever-expanding universe of print artifacts that had certain physical attributes and so forth. To get designers to engage in speculative design practice around that would be historically informed, in other words, that would not just simply step in and sort of invent things that didn't have any kind of currency or any kind of traction within the real issues. And within the seminar, we had open sessions where members of the library community were invited to join in the conversation. The first one we opened up, like 100 librarians showed up. It was amazing. And then the next one, 150. So there was anxiety, I think, about the reorganization that was going on, but there's also a sense that there was a real opportunity to create a kind of culture of play and experimentation, much of which, and I'm just going to quickly run through examples of student projects just to show how student designers engaged in this experiment, to show how people were trying to really think outside of the bounds of our conventional set of assumptions about what a library is. And throughout the 20th century, the answer to the question of what is a library has largely been a stack system, a storage system with access and distribution points, you could say. By the way, at Widener Library at Harvard, I don't know if you have a library on campus that's similar, the library is literally, the whole supporting structure is the stack system. You don't need external walls. The stack system is literally what holds the building up. So it literalizes this notion. So what do we do in a world where books are migrating to off-site storage facilities? That's been happening for 30, 40 years. Print continues to be produced at increasing rates, even as digital forms come in. So we have this new problem, which is intense redundancy. We have forms of documentation that have multiple lives. Print is incredibly stable. The digital is much more fluid and fragile. How do we imagine an institution that stores digital stuff? What's a bookshelf of ebooks look like? How do we imagine all of these various functions? Well, some of these student assignments are attempts to kind of think through scenarios for a future. This is one, those of you who know the GSD will recognize this is Gund Hall. So what if books searched for you once you had ever searched for them, in other words? So this is an exercise, an app, that any time you have ever looked for an item, it remembers you, and if you're in its physical proximity, it alerts you. It says, hello, I'm sitting around the corner. And by the way, these are all, this is perfectly technologically achievable. Or in a world where Wi-Fi is now the norm, where being networked is a constant, how do we design cold spots instead of hot spots? It used to be that the hot spot was something special. Now it's completely banal. every library is filled with hotspots. And yet, there's an abiding need for places of contemplation and refuge. People continue to go to reading rooms, to be in groups, yes, but also to find places of silence in a world that's filled. So why go to a library instead of Starbucks? Well, maybe it's because you're looking for a cold spot. Or how to redesign the carrel or the bench or the very furnishings that make up a library, maybe to make them into places where we display the curatorial work that's taking place. Most scholars will confess to going around the periphery of research libraries and spying like voyeurs on graduate students who are collecting materials, because that's where you see work in progress, right? So what if the furnishings were designed to feature curatorial work? Or how do we design library structures for parts of the world where there is no tradition of print-based culture, but there are other kinds of forms of language? Or the reference desk. What is a reference desk in a digital library or a library? Maybe it's a place that's a curated space where the reference librarian becomes like an artist in residence who puts on display corpora of materials like you would curate a show, like an exhibition. Or in the case of traversing labyrinthine type library structures like Widener Library, an app for sharing paths to find an object or to find a collection that's socially based, or a system of modules that allows you to add on capabilities to a library structure according to its demographics, or outdoor spaces that treat the outdoor world as an extension of the reading room, so that when you're sitting at a bus stop, you actually have a kind of reading device that's face-to-face with a bookshelf. I mean, as you can see, these are all playful exercises in trying to engage in speculative thinking about what a library could be, should be, might be interestingly, or not so. So in the wake of the first semester, there was so much interest in this sort of endeavor of creating a kind of culture of play and experimentation around the space of the library that we decided to found a kind of permanent lab, which iterates itself in the form of a course that keeps on going on every semester, called the Library Test Kitchen. And that's what you're going to see here. And again, the idea was to try to really create this sense of, I've already covered this, the sense of play around the library space. And this was done through a poster campaign, which is what you're looking at, sort of the reading hut, right? Or the barber shop that's been. And so this is sort of the library test kitchen in action. And you see some attempts at, here's the kind of Wi-Fi cold spot booth using paint that interrupts microwave transmissions. Biblio, who is your reading friend, is like a Tamaguchi who needs to be fed information. Otherwise he gets mad or he feels like he hasn't been fed sufficiently. There are actually very serious projects that have to do with using public library spaces as places of engagement with government documents and other kinds of such materials. And if you're interested in this project, oops, I was going to show you the actual, it should click through to the actual website. Let's see. It may not want to load there, but there we go. You can see a kind of pop-up space that we're developing right now to show some of the devices that have been built, some of the hacks of scanners, copying machines, other devices that we're thinking about in the context of the library test kitchen. It's an ongoing project. It's a student-driven project, and I think you'll have some fun there if you do go there. Okay, I want to talk now about Library Observatory. I've already anticipated this question, and we're just beginning to enter an era where libraries are beginning to share these tremendous assets that are their catalogs and to make them available to communities of researchers. As I said, these are assets that are extremely tightly curated using methodologies that have been pretty much standard over the course of, I mean, there's some variation, but they're fairly standardized. And certainly the major libraries have been using, the LC system or the Dewey system, essentially. So the question is, what are the interesting things we can do with these kinds of assets that allow us to operate on a scale that's vastly beyond the capabilities of any individual scholar? Harvard was one of the institutions that first started releasing its library data just in the last 6 months. So this summer we tried some experiments. I'm just going to show you a couple of visualizations. This is using the Harvard University collection, and it shows, as you can see, the correlation between non-English items in Harvard University bought during a certain period and the period to which they belong, which is showing you that there are these moments of backward buying, sort of where, in other words, where the collecting practice is not all about what's coming out today or what just came out in the last year, but rather backfilling in collections. It's maybe a slightly trivial example. One can look at, here's from the IMLS data set, intensity of borrowing activity relative to the number of registered buyers. The IMLS has collected these amazingly detailed records. How many miles a public library is from the nearest shopping center. How much they spend on what web access, how many packets of data have flowed, circulation records, everything you can imagine. It's an extraordinary resource. Okay, back to the evolution of early modern printing from 1400 to 1500. So what you're seeing here is this timeline, and for each event, each publishing event, which is captured in, what you're really seeing is the Harvard collection representation of the history of printing between 1400 and 15. You're seeing this dissemination of printing across different locations with different sort of publishing centers firing off and becoming a kind of node in a larger system. So I'm not going to, we've already lost enough time on this. I don't want to continue. So third area that I want to very briefly describe is bringing curatorial practice out into the landscape, into the environment. We have one project that's called Digital Ecologies, which is focused on living collections of trees, like the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard. How can we bring the kind of rich models of description, of reference, of narration to bear on living collections that are often experienced by people as natural landscapes, when in fact they're just as artificially constructed as the space of a gallery is. This is a project that's just beginning, but that thinks about the field notebook, about the observational techniques of the field of botany, techniques that are often employed by citizen botanists as well, people who are involved in observing, whether it's birding or observing blooming cycles of plants, are practiced, but are often not integrated. And we've used the same technique with the curation of urban landscapes as well. And I'm going to skip over this because I don't want to go on. I want to conclude here just talking very briefly about the question of things, of objects, of forms of knowledge that are locked up in the physical world. That typically, these are forms that have been marginal with respect to a dominant model of knowledge and scholarship that's linked to text-based communication. And you know, as somebody who's interested in design history, I'm very often struck by the relative difficulty that design history has had as a field. It's not even represented in most universities, or not really very well represented, in part because the kinds of stories that things tell have been considered secondary somehow to the larger world of knowledge. So this is a project that's trying to bring things, three-dimensional objects, into a the reality of a screen, an environment where we can work across media types. Trying to think about how to do that. This is what we call an active Susan. It's the opposite of a lazy Susan, right? These are our little scanning devices that we built that are made essentially to create a very fast and dirty, quick and dirty way of bringing objects into a screen environment where the objects can then become the basis for structures, for database structures. So instead of navigating a database through menus, which is of course a text-based model, what if you could rotate objects, use objects as the interface that allows you to explore the kind of different stories that they tell? That's the sort of hypothesis behind this work. The object that's been chosen here to be annotated is a Bialetti Mocha Express coffee maker. Not because it's a particularly salient example, but because it's a design object that tells a story about the evolution of coffee making on stovetops. But we could be looking at an object like this. This is what's called an ostrakon, which is an ancient Greek pottery shard. And as you will see, if the ostrakon decides to load here, maybe I can streamline this by showing you. Okay, no, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Let's see if it's No, it's going to be this one then. An ostrakon is a pottery shard. When the Greeks broke pots in the ancient world, nothing got thrown away. There wasn't an inexpensive place to write. Paper didn't exist. Papyrus was the surface that was available, but papyri came from Egypt. They were imported, they were very expensive, and they were fragile. So when you wanted to take notes, you used pottery shards. And when votes happened, for instance, to ostracize figures, to send them into exile, they used ostraka. That's the origin. It's the pottery shard. So these are objects. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these in collections. And each of them has inscriptions because they were like Post-it notes. So what would it be like if this world was a world where these objects became the kind of place where you could pin out? Some of these stories have to do with what's on the inscription. Some of them have to do with the pot that this came from, its form, the traces of different materials on the surface. There's a lot of different stories that such an artifact can sustain. So what we're working towards in this project is what we sometimes like to call a kind of a Facebook of things. Like, what if objects had friends? They do have friends, in fact. If you work in design history or you're an archaeologist, you know that ostrakon has a whole series of relations with other ostraka. And those fragments are not only related to themselves, but they're related to literary texts, to inscriptions and stone buildings. So what you're seeing here is an attempt to create a template that would be a different way of recording and representing objects as sets of relations, as incrustations of commentary, annotation, but also family histories, genealogical histories, if you like. And those include aspects, representations of these objects that are not visible to the naked eye, because that's one of the real questions here is we're not interested in trying to replace the experience of an original. That would be a kind of impoverished experience. I'd rather hold a piece of pottery in my hands and have it in front of me. But what if we could use that representation, first of all, to make it visible, because otherwise it's locked up in a storage chest, and second of all, to make it a research object for communities of researchers, and third of all, to add value to it, to show things about it that are not available to the naked eye, or features that maybe it's not the same as touching it, but almost allow you to touch it. Create something like the experience of touching it. In the case of manuscript culture, parchment was too valuable to throw away. So what did scribes often do? They cut pieces out, they re-glued it, they did all kinds of, they scraped away the surface and then they rewrote it. And so a lot of the kind of research methodologies that are being used in these fields, what they do is they use the new tools to expose material features that are only mildly available to us face to face. So this is the world that a lot of our work is sort of pushing towards, and I think you can, I hope you could see at least, and I apologize for the little technical glitch there, how some of those abstract threads that I was describing are animating different areas of experimental work. And none of these are completed projects. They're all forms of experimentation and research that move back and forth between the classroom and the research lab and the library, the archive, and the museum. Thank you.
Do you have energy for taking a few questions?
I'd be happy to. Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. No problem.
Starting with Jim Brophy in the back.
Yeah.
Very impressive talk. Just sparks our imagination. But the question that I have as a notionist humanist who can hardly run a regular PowerPoint program is, in order to conceptualize that is one thing, but in order to really to put it into practice, it seems like I would need a team of IT people to help me. I'm just wondering, in really making that work, if they're a reality, can you talk to us about those?
Sure. I mean, it's a very reasonable question. And one of the anxieties, I think, that even people who are sort of intrigued and tempted by embarking on this kind of adventure feel has to do with either one's own skills, strong in one area, maybe more limited in more technical areas, but also the infrastructure that's required to carry forward these projects. I think first of all, I do think many of these projects involve a different way of thinking. So I wouldn't deny that they take us from our comfort zone into places that we were not trained to go, and therefore that expand us or challenge us, as the case may be, for better or for worse. At the same time, like a lot of these projects begin with very simple kinds of challenges. And I skipped a slide where I was going to talk a little bit about, I mentioned the notion of project-based learning, which is essential to the sort of research projects that we run and other people run in the digital humanities. But sometimes those projects start like with problem solving in areas where we do have a lot of knowledge, even without, let's not bring the digital yet into the conversation, but in the case of libraries, for instance, the basic question about what could a reading room be, or ought a reading room be in the 21st century is a question that you, as a scholar who probably has spent a fair amount of time in reading rooms, probably have some interesting thoughts about. There's even a kind of field ethnography piece of a lot of these projects that involves really literally gathering intelligence or information about institutions and collections and practices that often don't have a lot of field ethnography attached to them. In the case of libraries, I was really astonished to find out that people really didn't actually, by people I mean sociologists and education theorists, even library scientists, hadn't really done a lot of studies of what people actually do in libraries. There was a lot of discourse about storage systems and classifications, but if you actually wanted to know, like, what does, like, at branch public libraries in rural America, what are the motivations for people going to the library instead of, reading the newspaper at, the mall? And a lot of the research dates from the last 10 years. And one of our graduate students actually did gather together a lot of the literature, and just the answer to that question is actually that the majority of people going to branch public libraries are looking for employment, which is probably not at the top of your list. It was certainly not at the top of my list. So I think that the answer to your question, it's a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think often one starts small, with really small, concrete tasks that are in our own environment. And the degree to which digital tools become relevant, they add value to those research questions, they add new dimensions of possibility, is sometimes very relative. Sometimes it's more about reframing a set of questions and gradually building up a research project where the digital enters in at a very later point, and where one turns the classroom into a kind of ethnographic space where you gather information about a phenomena that then become objects of elaboration. So I think these projects look very polished. They have a kind of certain look that make it look like it would be, the access point would be difficult and remote. But I think often, like some of the most interesting digital humanities projects start with very basic questions and use almost entirely off-the-shelf tools. Like tool building is one of the most dangerous and time-consuming and resource-consuming and often dead-end features of a lot of the history of the field. I think even John Unsworth himself would tell you he spent a lot of time at the University of Illinois building a series of platforms, and people didn't use them. So why do people use things? Well, it's because they're somehow passionate about either the objects or the questions that those tools or those resources raise, or they're already engaged in knowledge sharing, learning, making around those sets of artifacts. So I really deeply believe that one can start very small and very modest and not, I think there's a tendency to fetishize the digital. That's why I don't like the word digital in digital humanities, to think that the answers lie in the digital somehow, or that digital tools have the answers. But tools don't ask research questions. Tools enable, they constrain, they blind us, they open our eyes, and so they make a difference, but they don't make the transformative difference. The transformative difference often involves coupling a set of tools to a set of questions that they were not designed to answer and finding interesting ways to kind of get them to deviate from. And the history of the internet is all about that. Nobody ever designed the internet to become the internet. It was completely designed for something else. And so I think that's a space where people with expert knowledge in the kinds of fields that are under the umbrella of the traditional humanities, we sometimes have, I think, very smart and complex and sophisticated elements to add to conversations about how tools get used, for instance. So I think even for the least geeky of us, if we're willing to enter into a maybe slightly dangerous space for us, less comfortable space, that does involve collaboration and teamwork, working with people who have different assumptions, different sets of questions, different skills, it can be, I don't think we're giving up what we're good at. I think we can, if we're willing to engage in that kind of like process of translation and experimentation, we gain from it, but we also add value to other conversations that are happening. So I would be optimistic about that.
So let me just ask, so as a faculty member, I'm just following up on Jim's because I'm really interested in this stuff, but I don't want to be a coder, right? I'm interested in being a coder.
I'm with you, by the way.
Yeah. So,
I'm not a coder.
Yeah, so if a faculty member, is starting to work with something and it looks like it might have a digital presence that would be interesting, they come to you, right? They would come to you. And then I'm just trying to actually imagine the process.
Right, the process.
The process. Yeah. They would come to you and you would say, let me team you up with this smart X. Mm-hmm. Who is that X? Who is that person? I would be teamed up with. If I come to you and say I have this project, who do I get teamed up with?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a problem that I think that we all face when we're undertaking, like we know in a more traditional scholarly process, like you might go to the reference librarian to have some expert information about, but then the rest of the procedure, you know how to carry it out, right? Yeah, I mean, one model is certainly that somebody who has a lot of experience building teams, like in this sort of more laboratory-like model, can use that experience to help guide others who are just beginning to sort of dabble or enter into this world. And that's something that I did at Stanford, certainly, especially the early years of the Humanities Lab. Sort of matchmaking and team building. And, as a scholar, if you're used to the old world, where you basically got to decide what the interesting research questions are, you went out and did the research, and then some peer-reviewed environment said, good research questions, interesting work, not so interesting, right? It's a different way of working. So at the Humanities Lab at Stanford, and that's true at metaLAB, nobody, like you may come in with an idea, you may think you know what you want to do, but we always have a group of people who are all sitting there. It's much more like working in a museum or working in a design studio. We all brainstorm on everybody else's and troubleshoot everybody else's projects. So you're no longer alone in the room. And as a medievalist, I welcome that because I spent a lot of time alone in the room. Having a community, like having this collaborative kind of conversational dimension to being a researcher is something that I think most humanists miss. And the lab gives you that back. You give up something, which is that sense of autonomy. And sometimes you do know better. But a lot of the time you don't know better. And it's only when you're in the pressured environment of other people saying, no, that's the wrong way to go about this. Like you can't do, that's not an interesting way. Here's a different way. Here's a tool. Here's an approach. Here's a model you can look at. You lose some agency, but you gain the wisdom of the crowd, if you like. And so that kind of piece can be a really useful piece. I would say the one thing that really challenges like the way we think and the way we operate as scholars, especially as mature scholars in fields, I don't think it's about all of us becoming coders. We don't need all coders and projects. We need more design work often in web-based projects than we do coding. Mostly we're using off-the-shelf tools. Sometimes we're using them for things they were not designed for. Sometimes we're adding capabilities. So yes, coding is significant. But what's important, it seems to me, in terms of the individual scholar, is knowing what coding is, having a kind of general familiarity with what the issues are, what certain tools and technologies can do and what they can't do. And that's a kind of set of critical skills that we were not trained to do. And that's stuff you have to learn through experience, and it changes the way you think about how you design a project. So these are projects that are illustrative of a community of people who have been involved in these kinds of processes for a long time, so they have a kind of shared set of approaches, of solutions that they've adopted. And as we move from the outside into a kind of model like this, of course, there's a learning curve involved. But I've seen plenty of examples of scholars who have found this a really rich, enriching process. Others less. Some people think, forget it. I'm really good at what I do. I'll continue to do it. So a lot of it comes down to your individual temperament and your, degree of motivation.
Final question from Meg.
Thank you. Again, this was a wonderful talk. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned that it's important to think about ways to bridge the divide between, and I jotted down specialized and general audiences.
Yeah.
And then later, when you were showing us the shard, you mentioned very briefly about annotation. Are you and other your colleagues at metaLAB working on any kind of way of crowdsourcing any of these things to sort of bring in the general audience to bridge that?
Yes. Yes, because the issue of what happens with all these collections that are stashed away in the basement of the Smithsonian and other fantastic museums and archives and so forth. I might add that Harvard has, according to Bob Darnton, somewhere in the range of 70 linear miles of archives that have arrived at Harvard since the beginning of the 20th century that haven't been looked at yet. and that's just the tip of the iceberg, because I bet if you go around and you inventory all of these kinds of institutions, they're filled with stuff that's, like anybody in the fields that are involved would just salivate over, right? So how are we going to process all this stuff? One of the reasons that stuff is sitting in storage is because there is not a world of budgets that will ever come about that will allow for the processing of those materials. Even the richest, most privileged institutions are sitting on gold mines of cultural materials. And that's on the one side. The other side is our practices of processing and tagging and record making that are based on good 19th and 20th century scientific library science, archivistic methodologies, and our conservation practices all treat pretty much in a fairly undifferentiated way every artifact. We give the same attention to every artifact, whether it's a Rembrandt sketch or it's a clip of Allen Ginsberg's hair. The basic record-making and preservation models are largely the same. I mean, museums make some distinctions, but they don't make huge distinctions. And that creates another further obstacle to how you would break all those logjams. So one of the presuppositions in the Teaching with Things project is if we could create this very fast pipeline for creating manipulable 3D photogrammetric models of objects, create a template where the ways of capturing and representing these objects were rich, had these different kind of media features, allowed end users to add and tell stories about these objects and see what the relevant relations are. That it is essentially a crowdsourcing approach to how these objects also get classified, because a lot of these objects are going to have very little in the way of data. Sometimes they'll have lots of data, but the Library of Congress has done some experiments. Some of you may know the American Memory Project did this with some of its photo collections, which are phenomenal. They're like an extraordinarily rich record of American life from essentially the turn of the 20th century forward into the 1950s. Much of the collection sort of begins to trail off there. But most of those photographs are not tagged. And so what they tried as an experiment, they took part of the it was mostly sports and aviation collection. They put it up on Flickr. And 2/3 of that collection were processed. There were, I think, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 objects put onto Flickr. 2/3 of the collection were processed within a month. Because there are collector communities that know everything about those objects. You see a baseball player in a picture, they will tell you not only who it is, but why the uniform involves a hat that has 4 stripes instead of 2 stripes. Now that's not going to be true for Ostraka, There aren't like vast collector communities for ancient Greek pottery shards. But there's many, many, many categories of artifacts where a lot of expert knowledge lies outside of the walls of the academy, outside of the walls of museums. And so that's an area where you start to think about local history, you start to think about all these forms of memory and these cultural heritage corpora that never make it into the mainstream of research institutions, but that often hold really rich materials that where there's a lot of expertise at the local level. If you could bring those into public view, not only would you expedite the processing pipeline, but you really would add to different fields of knowledge.
It would change the way you design things too, I imagine, as well.
Yeah.
You'd be designing that kind of
Exactly. Yeah, and thinking about, I mentioned the Arboretum Project, we know that a lot of the people who go to a place like the Arboretum, like people who go to botanical gardens or to public parks, they're only interested in like one category of plants, or they have some passion, and often they know a tremendous amount about that small piece of the story. They're not going to write the book about park design in the 19th century, or about the botanical structure of the genome of sort of the sequoia, right? But they can really add value through the expert knowledge that they have in a smaller domain. And so I think it's really essential to leverage the power of that crowd, these different crowds, but not just the crowds, but also communities of expert researchers who are talking about the same objects, but telling very different stories. As I said, the archaeologist who's interested in like the history of Greek ceramics is interested in something very different than the people who are interested in the history of mechanisms of ostracism, or somebody's interested in the composition of the clay that was used by ancient Greek ceramicists. The world of cultural objects is a world that always tells a lot of stories, working on the same core of artifacts that will support those many stories. So what we're trying to do is really create a kind of context that enriches our models of description and representation and makes these corpora that are locked up into social corpora that can circulate, that can be taught, that can become focal points for different kinds of research communities. I mean, I'd be happy to answer another question, but we have to stop.
We have to stop. Join me in thanking Jeffrey for starting this